The wooden gavel slammed down against the bar counter, echoing like a gunshot through the smoky haze of the Oakhaven saloon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the gloom, illuminating the woman standing on the crate. She kept her head down, a ragged grey shawl, pulled tight to hide the angry violet burn scars that ravaged the left side of her face. The townsfolk jeered, cruel laughter bubbling up from their whiskey-soaked lips. They called her the Gargoyle of Oakhaven. No one raised a hand to bid. The silence stretched thick with humiliation until the heavy, rhythmic thud of spurred boots on floorboards silenced the room. A giant of a man stepped from the shadows. It was Silas Kincaid, the recluse from the high peaks, a man rumored to hunt with wolves and kill with his bare hands. He didn't look at the crowd. He slapped a heavy pouch of gold dust on the bar. "I'll take her," he rasped. No one knew it then. But in that moment, the fate of the entire Colorado Territory had just shifted. October 14th, 1874. The Colorado Territory was a place where a man could lose his life for a horse, and a woman without protection was considered less than the dirt on a boot heel. In the mining town of Oakhaven, morality had long ago been traded for silver nuggets. The bride auction wasn't official, of course. The law didn't strictly permit the selling of women, but Mayor Halloway called it a sponsorship program for destitute orphans. In reality, it was a market for labor and loneliness. Sarah Jenkins stood on the crate, her hands trembling beneath the frayed wool of her dress. She was 24, considered an old maid by frontier standards, and damaged goods by any standard. The fire that had taken her parents 3 years ago in St. Louis had left her with nothing but a name she hated and a face that made children cry. The scar tissue rippled from her left temple down to her jaw, pulling her eye slightly downward, a permanent mask of tragedy. "Come on now, gents," the auctioneer. A greasy man named Tobias Finch hollered. "She's got strong teeth and she can scrub a floor." Do I hear $5? 2. Laughter rippled through the room. A drunk miner in the front row spat tobacco juice near Sarah's hem. "I wouldn't pay a nickel for a face that'd sour my milk." Sarah closed her eyes. "Just let me die," she prayed silently. "Let the floor open up and swallow me whole." She had fled the east to escape the whispers, only to find the shouts of the west were far louder. That was when the swinging doors groaned open. The air in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas Kincaid was a legend in Oakhaven, though not the kind you told to children at bedtime. He was a mountain man who lived above the timberline near the jagged peaks of the San Juans. He came down only twice a year for supplies. He stood 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to carry a felled pine. His beard was a thicket of black and grey, and his eyes were the color of cold steel. The crowd parted. Even the drunk miner pulled his legs in. Silas walked to the bar, the smell of pine resin, old leather, and gunpowder trailing him. He looked at Tobias Finch, then shifted his gaze to Sarah. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her with lust. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sturdy tool he might need. He assessed her. "I need a woman to keep the cabin," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "Winter's comin'. I need someone to cook and cure the hides while I trap." "She's yours for $10, Kincaid." Tobias laughed nervously. "Though I warn you, she's spooked easily." Silas didn't haggle. He dropped a heavy leather pouch on the counter. It hit with a dull, heavy thud that suggested it held far more than $10 worth of gold dust. "Pack your things," he said to Sarah. Sarah looked up, her good eye wide with terror. This man looked like a bear that had learned to walk upright. He was terrifying, but he was also her only exit from the crate. "I have nothing to pack, sir," she whispered. Silas grunted. He took off his heavy buffalo hide coat and tossed it at her. It smelled of wood smoke and rain. "Put it on. It's freezing on the ridge." As they walked out, the saloon fell silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the cracks in the walls. Sarah kept her head down, but she felt the eyes of the town burning into her back. She was leaving one hell only to walk into the lair of a monster. Or so she thought. What the town didn't see was the way Silas positioned himself between Sarah and the crowd as they exited his hand, hovering near the cult peacemaker on his hip. He wasn't dragging her, he was escorting her. But the real drama began when they reached his wagon. A man was watching from the alleyway. A man in a suit too fine for a mining town, with a Pinkerton Detective Agency badge hidden inside his lapel. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and scribbled, "Subject located. Moving north. The target is secured." The journey to Kincaid's cabin took 3 days. It was a brutal ascent into the clouds where the air grew thin and the trees turned into twisted skeletons of ancient pine. For the first 2 days, Silas spoke less than 10 words. He was a man of absolute efficiency. He drove the mules with subtle clicks of his tongue and navigated the treacherous switchbacks with an instinct that seemed supernatural. Sarah sat on the bench seat beside him, wrapped in the buffalo coat that swallowed her small frame. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was rough-hewn, his hands scarred and calloused, his face weathered by wind and sun. He seemed part of the mountain itself, unforgiving and hard. On the second night, they made camp near a rushing stream. The cold was biting a sharp reminder that winter in the Rockies was a death sentence for the unprepared. Silas built a fire with practiced ease. He roasted a rabbit he had snared earlier, offering Sarah the leg with the most meat. "Eat," he commanded. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice raspy from disuse. She pulled her shawl tight instinctively, covering the left side of her face. Silas sat on a log opposite her, sharpening his skinning knife. The rhythmic shing sound of steel on stone was hypnotic. Suddenly he stopped. "You don't have to hide it from me," he said. He didn't look up from the knife. Sarah froze. "Hide what?" "The face. I've seen worse. I've seen a man mauled by a cougar, half his head gone, and he still lived to tell the tale. A burn is just a mark of survival." Sarah felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "It offends people." "It offends weak people," Silas muttered. He looked up, then his steel eyes piercing her defense. "How'd it happen?" Sarah hesitated. The lie she had told for 3 years was ready on her tongue. A lantern fell in the barn. But something about the vast emptiness of the mountains, or perhaps the blunt honesty of the man across the fire, made the lie stick in her throat. "It wasn't an accident," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a lesson." Silas stopped sharpening. He looked at her. Really looked at her for a long moment. He didn't ask who taught the lesson. He didn't ask for the gruesome details. He simply nodded, sheathed his knife, and poked the fire. "Fire clears the underbrush," Silas said quietly. "Makes room for new growth. But it hurts like hell when it burns." That night, Sarah slept fitfully. She dreamed of the mansion in Boston, not St. Louis. She dreamed of the heavy velvet curtains and the smell of expensive cigars. She dreamed of her Uncle Cornelius Whitney and the glass of acid he had held in his hand. His face twisted in a sneer. "If you won't marry the Senator, Isabella, I will make sure no man ever wants to look at you again." She woke up screaming. Before she could even catch her breath, a heavy hand was on her shoulder. She thrashed, terrified, but the hand was steady. "Easy?" Silas's voice was a low rumble in the dark. "You're safe. It's just the wind." She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her scarred cheek. She expected him to yell to tell her to shut up. Instead, he handed her a tin cup of water. He sat guard by the fire for the rest of the night, his back to her, a silent sentinel against the darkness of her memories. The next afternoon, the wagon cleared the timberline. The cabin appeared nestled in a sheltered bowl beneath a towering granite peak. It was built of massive logs, sturdy and low to the ground, to withstand the avalanches. As they pulled up, Silas jumped down and helped her descend. His hands were large, spanning her to her waist, but he lifted her gently. "Home," he said. Sarah looked at the desolate, beautiful landscape. It was terrifyingly isolated. If he wanted to kill her here, no one would ever know. "Why me?" she asked, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "Why did you buy me Mr. Kincaid?" There were younger women. Prettier women. Silas unhitched the mules. He paused, patting the flank of the lead mule. "I didn't want a pretty woman," Silas said, looking out over the valley where the eagle soared. "Pretty women want the city. They want silk and parties. I wanted someone who knows what it's like to be broken. Because this mountain," he gestured to the jagged peaks, "it breaks everyone eventually. Only the ones who've already been broken know how to put themselves back together." He looked at her, and for the first time the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "And you, Sarah Jenkins, or whatever your real name is, you have the eyes of a wolf that's been caught in a trap and chewed its own leg off to get free. That's the kind of partner I need." Sarah's blood ran cold. Whatever your real name is, he knew, or at least he suspected. She gripped her shawl tighter. The mountain man wasn't just a brute. He was observant, and that made him dangerous. But as she stepped into the cabin, seeing the rough-hewn table and the dusty hearth, she realized something else. He hadn't asked for her real name. He had given her the space to keep her secret, for now. November brought the snow, and with it a silence so profound it felt heavy on the chest. The cabin, buried halfway up the granite slope, became a tiny island of warmth in a sea of white violence. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah, or Isabella, as she whispered to herself in the dark, moved through the cabin like a ghost. She was terrified of making a mistake. In her uncle's house in Boston, a mistake meant a cane across the knuckles. Here she feared it meant being cast out into the freezing void. Silas was a man of rhythms. He woke before dawn, stoked the fire, drank coffee black as tar, and disappeared into the tree line to check his trap lines. He returned at dusk, smelling of cold air and musk, usually carrying a brace of snowshoe hares or a beaver pelt. He didn't beat her. He barely spoke to her. But he watched her. One evening, Sarah attempted to make a stew. She had never cooked a day in her life before the fire. Servants had done that. During her years of destitution after running away, she had survived on scraps. Now faced with a skinned rabbit and a sack of potatoes, she was lost. She boiled the meat until it was grey rubber, and the potatoes were mush. When she set the bowl before Silas, her hands shook. Silas took a bite. He chewed slowly, his jaw muscles working the tough meat. The silence stretched for an agonizing minute. Sarah braced herself for the plate to be thrown. Instead, Silas swallowed. "Needs salt," he grunted. He reached for the tin and sprinkled some in. "And throw the wild onions in later next time. They turn bitter if you boil 'em too long." He continued to eat. He ate every bite. Sarah stared at him. "You aren't angry?" Silas looked up, wiping his beard with the back of his hand. "Starving is a sin, Sarah. Bad cooking is just a mistake. You'll learn." That night, for the first time, Sarah didn't cry herself to sleep. The turning point came 3 weeks later. A blizzard had been howling for 2 days, trapping them inside. On the third morning, the wind died, and Silas went out to clear the heavy drifts from the roof. Sarah was sweeping the hearth when she heard a sickening crack, followed by a muffled shout. She threw open the heavy oak door. Silas was lying in the snow near the woodpile. A massive icicle sharp as a spear and heavy as an anvil had broken off the eaves and struck his shoulder, sending him crashing onto the blade of the axe he had been holding. "Silas!" she screamed, the wind snatching the name from her lips. She didn't freeze. The terrified girl on the auction block vanished, and something else took over, a dormant instinct from a life she had tried to forget. She ran to him. The snow around him was already turning a shocking crimson. The axe blade had sliced deep into his thigh, nicking an artery. Silas was groaning, his face grey, his teeth gritted in agony. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. "Don't move," she commanded. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was the authoritative tone of the Whitney bloodline. She grabbed him under the arms. He was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She dragged him through the snow, inch by agonizing inch, until they tumbled through the doorway. She kicked the door shut and dragged him to the bearskin rug before the fire. "Whiskey," she snapped, "and your sewing kit, now." Silas, dazed from blood loss, pointed weakly to the shelf. Sarah moved with a terrifying precision. She poured whiskey over the gaping wound. Silas roared, his back arching off the floor. "Hold still," she hissed. "The femoral artery is intact, but the vastus medialis is severed. If I don't close this, you'll bleed out in 10 minutes. Silas, through the haze of pain, looked at her. Vastus medialis. Those were doctor's words, Latin words, not the words of a burnt-faced orphan from the slums. Sarah threaded the needle. She didn't have surgical silk, only heavy thread, meant for mending canvas breeches. It would have to do. "This is going to hurt," she said, looking him in the eye. "Drink." She forced the bottle to his lips. He took 3 long pulls. Then she began to sew. Her hands, usually so timid, were steady as rocks. She pinched the skin, driving the needle through tough muscle. Silas groaned, his hand gripping the leg of the table until the wood creaked, but he didn't pull away. He watched her. He watched the way she cleaned the wound, the way she tied off the sutures with a specific complex knot used by surgeons, not seamstresses. It took 20 minutes. When she was done, she wrapped the leg tightly in clean linens she had torn from her own petticoats. She sat back on her heels, covered in his blood, her hair escaping her bun, her scarred face illuminated by the firelight. She was panting. Silas lay there, chest heaving. The bleeding had stopped. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice rough with pain and shock. "That wasn't mere woman's work. You stitched like a field surgeon." Sarah froze. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her trembling. She looked down at her bloody hands. "My uncle," she whispered, the truth leaking out before she could stop it. "He was a man of science. He let me read his books. He let me watch when the doctors came." "Rich men have doctors come to the house," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "Poor men go to the barber or the horse leech." Sarah turned her face away, hiding the scar. "I wasn't always poor, Silas, and I wasn't always ugly." Silas reached out, his hand calloused and massive, wrapped around her small, blood-stained wrist. He didn't pull her. He just held her anchor. "You ain't ugly, Sarah," he said softly. "And today, you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The air in the cabin shifted. The dynamic of master and servant, of rescuer and rescued, dissolved. They were just two people trapped in the sky, bound by blood and snow. December 20th, 1874. Silas healed with the unnatural speed of a wild animal, though the limp would stay with him for the rest of the winter. During his recovery, the cabin transformed. It ceased to be a shelter and became a home. Sarah Isabella took over the daily operations. She learned to chop kindling her swing, improving until she could split a log with a single crack. She learned to identify the tracks of the snowshoe hare and the dangerous print of the mountain lion. But more importantly, she began to read to him. Silas had a few books, battered and water-stained, kept in a trunk. Shakespeare, the Bible, and a copy of the Odyssey. In the long evenings, while the wind screamed like a banshee outside, Sarah would read aloud. Her voice, once raspy and shy, grew clear and melodic. She fell into the cadence of her education, her accent shifting from the flat effect of a beggar back to the refined transatlantic clip of Boston high society. Silas would whittle by the fire, listening. He realized he was living with a ghost of the upper class. He pieced it together, the Latin, the accent, the way she held her spine straight when she thought no one was looking. She was running from something far worse than poverty. But down in the valley, the snow was melting and the rot was setting in. In Oakhaven, Arthur Hayes sat in the corner of the saloon, nursing a glass of expensive brandy. He was a man who looked out of place in the West, yet his eyes held a cruelty that fit right in. He took a photograph out of his pocket. It was an old tintype. It showed a stunningly beautiful young woman with flawless skin standing next to a stern older man with mutton chop whiskers, Cornelius Whitney. "You say a man bought a scarred woman here in October?" Hayes asked the bartender. The bartender, wiping a glass, nodded. "Aye. Silas Kincaid took the gargoyle off our hands. Best thing that ever happened to this town." "Kincaid?" Hayes tested the name. "Where does he live?" "High Peaks, Eagle's Nest Ridge. But you can't get up there now. Pass is blocked until spring." Hayes smiled. It was a cold, reptilian smile. "I don't need to wait for spring. I have money, and money melts snow faster than the sun." Hayes wasn't just a detective. He was a cleaner for the Whitney family. Cornelius Whitney had seized his niece's inheritance, a shipping fortune worth millions, after her parents died. But there was a clause in the will: if Isabella married before the age of 25, the fortune reverted to her. Cornelius had tried to force her to marry a corrupt senator to control the money. When she refused, he had arranged the accident with the acid to ruin her marketability. But he hadn't expected her to run, and as long as she was alive, the fortune was vulnerable. She had to be erased. Hayes hired 3 men that night. One was the drunk miner who had spat at Sarah during the auction. The other 2 were brothers, the McCanns' known cattle rustlers, who would slit a throat for a pair of boots. "We ride at first light," Hayes ordered. $500 a head when the job is done." Back on the mountain, the solstice arrived. Silas, his leg significantly stronger, decided to check the lower ridge for elk. The larder was getting low. "Stay inside," he told Sarah. "The wolves are hungry this time of year." "Come back safe," she said. She didn't look away from him. Without thinking, she reached out and straightened his collar. Silas froze. The intimacy of the gesture was startling. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing the jagged ridge of the scar. "I always come back," he promised. He rode the mule down the switchbacks, the air crisp and biting. He traveled 3 miles down to the tree line. He found elk tracks, but he found something else too. Stopping his mule, Silas slid to the ground. He knelt by a patch of disturbed snow. Horse manure, fresh. He crumbled it in his gloved hand. It was still warm. Silas scanned the tree line. He saw the broken branch of a spruce snapped by a rider passing too close. He saw the imprint of a horseshoe, a flat shoe, the kind used by city horses, not the cleated shoes of mountain pack animals. 4 riders, moving up. Silas felt a cold dread in his gut that had nothing to do with the winter. They were coming for her. He didn't hunt the elk. He spun the mule around and drove his spurs into its flanks. The mule brayed in protest, but surged up the icy trail. He burst into the cabin an hour later, breathless. Sarah looked up from her mending, alarmed. "Silas!" "What is it?" He didn't answer. He went straight to the gun rack. He pulled down the Winchester repeating rifle and a box of ammunition. Then he grabbed his heavy Colt revolver and shoved it into his belt. "Pack a bag," he ordered. "Food, blankets, ammunition. Now." "Why? What's happening?" Sarah stood up, the fabric falling from her lap. Silas turned to her. His face was a mask of war. "Men are coming. 4 of them. Heavily armed." He walked over to her and grabbed her shoulders. "They aren't locals, Sarah. They're riding city horses." Sarah's face went pale, the scar standing out like a violet lightning bolt. "It's him," she whispered. "He found me." "Who?" Silas shook her gently. "I need to know what we are fighting, Sarah. No more lies. Who is coming up my mountain?" Sarah looked into his eyes and saw no judgment, only a fierce, protective fire. "My uncle sent them," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "My name is Isabella Whitney. I am the heiress to the Whitney Shipping Company of Boston. And the man coming, he isn't here to take me back, Silas. He's here to kill me." Silas stared at her. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. The education, the fear, the burns. It wasn't just cruelty. It was greed. Cold, calculated greed. He released her shoulders and racked the lever of the Winchester. Clack, clack. "Well, Miss Whitney," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly growl. "They might have bought the law in Boston, but up here, the only law is gravity. And they have a long way to fall." He kicked the table over to create a barricade in front of the door. "Can you shoot?" he asked. Sarah looked at the heavy revolver he offered her. She thought of her father, who had taught her to shoot skeet on the lawn of their summer estate before the fire took everything. She took the gun. It was heavy cold and smelled of oil. "I don't miss," she said. Silas grinned, a feral showing of teeth. "Good, because company's here." A gunshot cracked through the valley, shattering the window pane above the sink. Glass sprayed across the floor. The siege of Eagle's Nest had begun. The silence of the mountains was replaced by a cacophony of violence. Bullets chewed through the pine logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying like deadly shrapnel. The air inside turned hazy with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Silas Kincaid moved with the fluidity of a predator. He didn't run. He slid. He kicked over the heavy oak table, creating a V-shaped barricade near the window. "Keep your head down," he roared over the din. Sarah was huddled behind the overturned table, her hands gripping the heavy Colt revolver so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't screaming. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity. This was familiar. The chaos, the noise, it was just like the night of the fire in St. Louis. Only this time, she wasn't a child trapped in a bedroom. She was armed. Outside, Arthur Hayes's voice cut through the gunfire, calm and terrifyingly polite. "Mr. Kincaid, there is no need for this uncivilized behavior. Send the girl out. She is stolen property. Surrender her, and we ride away. You keep your gold, your furs, and your life." Silas spat on the floor. He peeked through a chink in the logs. He saw movement behind the woodpile, a flash of a brown duster. Crack! Silas fired the Winchester. A scream echoed from the woodpile, followed by a stream of profanity. "I don't barter with flesh, Hayes," Silas shouted back, his voice booming. "And I don't deal with men who hide behind trees. Step out here and talk like a man." "Have it your way," Hayes replied. The gunfire intensified. The attackers were suppressing them, keeping their heads down. "They're flanking," Silas hissed. He looked at Sarah. "They're trying to get to the back door. The woodshed connects to the pantry. If they get in there, we're cornered." He looked at the heavy iron stove, then at Sarah. He grabbed a box of shells and slid it across the floor to her. "I need you to cover the front," Silas said, his eyes locking onto hers. "If anything moves past that tree line, you shoot. Don't aim. Just point and squeeze. Make them think we have an army in here." "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, panic flaring in her chest. "I'm going to welcome the guests at the back door." Silas grabbed his hunting knife and a second pistol from the mantel, a jagged sawed-off shotgun he used for snakes. He crawled low, disappearing into the shadows of the pantry. Sarah was alone in the main room. The front window was a jagged maw of broken glass. She saw a shadow detach itself from the pines. It was the drunk miner, emboldened by the whiskey and the promise of gold. He was running toward the porch, a torch in his hand. Fire. They were going to burn them out. Sarah raised the heavy Colt. It wavered. The man was 30 yards away. "Don't aim. Just point." She pulled the hammer back. The click sounded deafening in her ears. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked violently, bruising her wrist. The bullet missed the miner, kicking up a spray of snow 3 feet to his left. But it did its job. The miner dove face first into the snow, dropping the torch. "She's shooting!" the miner yelled, crawling backward. "The bitch is shooting back." Meanwhile, at the rear of the cabin, the heavy latch of the woodshed door began to lift. A knife blade slid through the crack, working the bar. Silas stood in the darkness of the pantry, his breathing slow and controlled. He waited. The door creaked open. A rush of cold air swirled in. One of the McCann brothers stepped inside, a grin on his face, a Bowie knife in his hand. He stepped forward, eyes adjusting to the gloom. He never saw Silas. Silas stepped from the side, grabbing McCann by the collar and slamming him face first into the pantry shelves. Jars of preserved peaches shattered, slicking the floor with syrup and glass. McCann grunted, slashing wildly with his knife. The blade caught Silas's forearm, slicing through the heavy wool of his shirt, drawing blood. Silas didn't flinch. He drove a knee into McCann's stomach, doubling him over, and brought the butt of the shotgun down on the back of the man's head. McCann crumpled, but the second brother was right behind him. He leveled a revolver at Silas. Bang! The shot went wild, burying itself in the ceiling as Silas kicked the door shut on the man's arm. The brother screamed as the heavy oak crunched bone. Silas fired the shotgun through the wood of the door. The screaming stopped. Silas stood panting in the pantry blood, dripping from his arm, the smell of peaches and cordite thick in the air. 2 down. But then he smelled something else. Smoke. Not from gunpowder. Wood smoke. "Silas!" Sarah's voice shrieked from the main room. "The roof!" They threw the torch on the roof. Silas ran back into the main room. Orange light was already flickering through the gaps in the ceiling boards. The dry pine needles and moss used for insulation were tinder. The cabin wasn't just burning. It was an oven. "We have to move!" Silas shouted. He grabbed his heavy buffalo coat and threw it over Sarah, extinguishing a spark that had landed on her dress. "Go where?" Sarah coughed, the smoke thickening rapidly. "They're waiting outside. The mine shaft," Silas said. 50 yards east, behind the boulder. It connects to the lower creek bed. It's our only chance." He grabbed a heavy sack of ammunition and the Winchester. "I'll draw their fire," Silas said, gripping her shoulders hard. "You run for the boulder. Don't look back. Don't stop. If I fall, you keep running. Do you hear me, Isabella?" He used her real name. It was an acknowledgement of who she was. Not just his cook, but a woman of worth, a woman with a life to save. "I won't leave you," she cried, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "You aren't leaving me." Silas lied. "You're scouting the path. Go." Silas kicked the front door open and unleashed a roar that shook the snow from the trees. He stepped onto the porch, the Winchester blazing, firing rapidly at the tree line where Hayes and the remaining men were hiding. "Run!" Sarah bolted. She dove off the side of the porch, scrambling into the deep snow, her skirts tangling around her legs. She clawed her way toward the massive granite boulder that marked the mine entrance. Behind her, the cabin was a torch against the night sky. Bullets zipped past her, buzzing like angry hornets. She heard Silas shouting the boom of his rifle, answering the cracks of the attackers' pistols. She reached the boulder and looked back. Silas wasn't running. He was standing behind the water trough, pinned down by heavy fire from 2 directions. Hayes had anticipated the move. He had men in the trees on the east side, too. Silas was trapped. The heat from the burning cabin was intense enough to melt the snow on the porch, creating a slick slush of mud and ash. Silas changed the magazine on his Winchester, his hands slick with blood from the cut on his arm. He glanced toward the boulder. He saw Sarah's pale face peeking out. She hadn't gone into the mine. She was waiting for him. "Stubborn woman," he growled, though a fierce pride swelled in his chest. He had to move. If he stayed here, he would burn or be shot. If he ran, he was an open target. He saw Hayes emerge from the tree line, walking confidently, a long-barreled Schofield revolver in his hand. Hayes was smiling. The firelight danced in his eyes, making him look like a devil in a bespoke suit. "It's over, Kincaid," Hayes shouted. "The roof is coming down. Give it up." Silas stood up. He didn't raise his hands. He raised the rifle. But before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out from the side, a sniper Hayes had positioned on the ridge above. The bullet struck Silas in the right shoulder, spinning him around. The rifle flew from his numb fingers. He stumbled, falling hard against the burning logs of the cabin wall. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker driven through his joint. "No!" Sarah screamed. She abandoned the safety of the boulder. She ran back toward the fire, toward him. "Sarah, don't!" Silas groaned, sliding down the wall. He reached for the Colt in his belt with his left hand, but his vision was swimming. Sarah reached him, grabbing his good arm, trying to haul him up. "Get up, Silas. Please, get up. Run," he rasped. "Isn't this touching?" Hayes's voice dripped with sarcasm. He was standing 10 feet away, the gun leveled at Silas's head. 2 other men emerged from the smoke surrounding them. Sarah spun around, shielding Silas with her body. She raised the heavy revolver she still held, aiming it at Hayes's chest. "Back off!" she screamed. "I'll kill you!" Hayes didn't flinch. He just tutted. Isabella, put the gun down. You know you don't have the stomach for cold-blooded murder. Accidental thoughts in barns are one thing. This is another." He stepped closer. "And look at your beast. He's done. Even if I let you walk away, he'll bleed out in an hour or freeze to death. The cabin is gone. The supplies are gone." Hayes looked at Silas, who was struggling to stay conscious. "You put up a good fight, mountain man, but you were punching above your weight class. This creates a loose end." Hayes cocked the hammer. "No." Sarah lunged. She wasn't fast enough to shoot Hayes, but she was fast enough to knock his aim. The gun went off. The bullet didn't hit Silas's head. It caught him in the side, just above the hip. The impact lifted him, throwing him backward over the edge of the porch railing. Below the porch was a steep, icy ravine that led down to the freezing river. Sarah watched in horror as Silas tumbled backward. He hit the snow, rolling his body limp, crashing through the brush, down, down, down into the darkness of the gorge. A splash echoed up, followed by silence. "Silas!" Her scream tore her throat raw. She tried to jump after him, but rough hands grabbed her. The surviving McCann brother held her arms, pinning them behind her back. "He's dead, darling," Hayes said, holstering his gun and dusting ash off his lapel. "The river runs under the ice down there. No man survives that fall, let alone with 2 bullets in him." Sarah fought. She kicked, she bit, she spat in Hayes's face. Hayes wiped the spittle away calmly and backhanded her hard. The blow sent her reeling, her vision blacking out for a second. "That is enough," Hayes said coldly. "Bind her hands. Gag her. We have a long ride to Denver to catch the train east." He leaned in close to her ear as the men tied her wrists with brutal efficiency. "Your uncle is very eager to see you, Isabella. He has the wedding papers drawn up. And don't worry about your face. A heavy veil covers a multitude of sins." They dragged her away from the burning ruin of the cabin. Sarah looked back one last time at the dark ravine. The snow was covering the tracks. The fire roared, consuming the only home she had known where she felt safe. "He's not dead," she told herself, a mantra against the despair. "He is the mountain. You cannot kill the mountain." The abyss. At the bottom of the ravine, the world was cold and wet. Silas had not fallen into the main current. He had crashed through a shelf of ice and landed on a sandbar, partially submerged in freezing slush. The pain was absolute. It was a living thing that ate his consciousness. His shoulder was shattered. His side was burning. The cold water was already sucking the heat from his core. He tried to move, and blackness swarmed the edges of his vision. He lay there, staring up at the distant orange glow of his burning home high above. He closed his eyes. It would be easy to let go. Just sleep. The pain would stop. The cold would turn warm, as it always did before the end. You have the eyes of a wolf that's been caught in a trap and chewed its own leg off to get free. His own words echoed in his mind. He heard a sound. Not the wind. Not the water. Steps. Soft padded steps in the snow. Silas forced his heavy eyelids open. A pair of yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. Then another pair. Then a third. The wolf pack. The timber wolves of the San Juans. He had hunted them, and they had hunted his mules. They knew blood. They smelled the weakness. The alpha male, a massive beast with a scarred ear, stepped onto the sandbar. He lowered his head, sniffing the air. He growled a low vibration that Silas felt in his chest. Silas couldn't reach his knife. It was gone. He had nothing. "Come on, then." Silas wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. "Finish it." The wolf stepped closer. It sniffed Silas's hand, the hand that smelled of gunpowder and pine. The wolf didn't bite. It licked the blood from Silas's frozen fingers. Then it threw its head back and howled a long, mournful sound that echoed up the canyon walls, a signal to the wild. Silas didn't die. The anger wouldn't let him. The image of Sarah's terrified face, dragged away by a man in a silk suit, was a coal burning in his gut that was hotter than the freezing river. He drove his fingers into the frozen mud. He dragged himself 1 inch, then another. He wasn't a man anymore. He was something else. He was the reckoning. The long crawl. The river did not kill Silas Kincaid, though it tried its very best. He washed ashore 2 miles downstream, a broken heap of bone and frozen flesh. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of a fever delirium in a cave made of tree roots. He survived on snow and the raw meat of a squirrel he managed to kill with a rock, his left hand trembling violently. It was an old Ute trapper named Red Elk who found him. Red Elk had seen the smoke from the burning cabin miles away. He didn't ask questions. He stitched Silas's side with sinew and set the shattered shoulder with a brutal efficiency that made Silas black out from the pain. "You should be dead, mountain walker," Red Elk said, feeding him broth made of bone marrow. "The spirits pushed you back." "Not the spirits," Silas rasped, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "A woman." It took 2 months for Silas to stand without falling. It took another month for him to walk. By the time the snow melted in the Rockies, revealing the blackened skeleton of his cabin. Silas was a changed man. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his beard streaked with white. He moved with a permanent limp, a hitch in his gait that required a heavy hickory cane. But the weakness of the body only calcified the hardness of his mind. He dug up his cache of gold, the savings of 20 years of trapping which he had buried beneath the floorboards of the woodshed, the only part of the cabin that hadn't burned completely. He didn't buy a mule. He bought a ticket on the Union Pacific Railroad. The Golden Cage. May, 1875. Boston, Massachusetts. The world of Isabella Whitney was a nightmare of silk and suffocating perfume. She was a prisoner in her own home. Her uncle Cornelius Whitney had played the grieving guardian perfectly. He told society that his poor niece had been found living in squalor, kidnapped by savages, her mind broken. He claimed he was saving her. The wedding to Senator Reginald Thorne was set for the 1st of June. It was to be the social event of the season. Thorne was a man of 50 with cold, wet hands and a political debt that Isabella's dowry would conveniently wipe out. Isabella sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The maids had applied heavy theatrical powder to the left side of her face, caking it on to hide the violet scars. It didn't work. The texture of the ruined skin, still showed through a map of her suffering. "You look almost presentable," Cornelius said, stepping into her room without knocking. "Senator Thorne is a forgiving man. He is willing to overlook your deformity for the sake of the family alliance." "I am pregnant," Isabella said. Her voice was flat dead. Cornelius froze. The smile vanished. "What did you say?" Isabella turned to him. "I am carrying a child. Silas Kincaid's child. If I marry the senator, he will be raising a mountain man's bastard." Cornelius's face turned purple. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped her chin, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You will tell no one," he hissed. "We will send the child away to an orphanage the moment it is born. Or perhaps it will be stillborn. These things happen." "He will come for me," Isabella whispered. "He is not dead." Cornelius laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "My dear Arthur Hayes is the best killer money can buy. Your savage is rotting in a canyon. You are alone. You have always been alone." The wedding of the century. The Trinity Church was packed. The elite of Boston sat in stiff rows, fanning themselves against the humidity. They were there for the spectacle, the return of the scarred heiress. Arthur Hayes stood at the back of the church, leaning against a pillar, checking his pocket watch. He had been paid a bonus to ensure the ceremony went smoothly. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the instinct of a hunter being watched, but when he turned, he saw only the heavy oak doors. The organ music swelled. The doors opened. Isabella walked down the aisle. She wore a veil of thick lace that completely obscured her face. Her dress was imported satin, worth more than Silas's entire cabin. She walked like a woman marching to the gallows. She reached the altar. Senator Thorne stood there, sweating a greedy gleam in his eyes. Cornelius stood beside her, his hand gripping her elbow tightly, a silent threat. The priest began the liturgy. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words washed over Isabella. She closed her eyes beneath the veil. "Silas," she thought. "I'm sorry. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence that followed was customary, a formality. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the church boomed open. It wasn't the wind. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright daylight of the street. He wore a dusty black frock coat that was too tight in the shoulders. He wore boots that were scuffed and worn. He leaned heavily on a hickory cane. He looked like a wolf that had broken into a sheep pen. Arthur Hayes pushed off the pillar, his hand going to his coat pocket. "You," he whispered, his eyes widening in disbelief. Silas Kincaid didn't look at the crowd. He hobbled forward, the thump-drag of his cane echoing on the marble floor. "I object," Silas said. His voice was not the polite tenor of a Boston gentleman. It was the gravelly rumble of an avalanche. Gasps rippled through the pews. Cornelius Whitney turned pale. "Remove this vagrant," he shouted. Hayes stepped into the aisle, blocking Silas's path. "You're a hard man to kill, Kincaid, but this is a civilized city. You can't just walk in here." Silas stopped. He looked at Hayes. The scar on his own shoulder throbbed. "I didn't come to kill you, Hayes," Silas said quietly. "I came to testify." "Testify to what?" Silas looked past Hayes, locking eyes with the veiled woman at the altar. "That the lady is already married." Chaos erupted. Senator Thorne looked at Cornelius. "What is the meaning of this?" "He's lying!" Cornelius shrieked. "He's a madman!" Silas reached into his coat. Hayes flinched, drawing his pistol. The ladies in the front row screamed, but Silas didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was charred at the edges, stained with soot and blood. It was the bill of sale from the Oakhaven saloon. October 14th, 1874. Silas read his voice, cutting through the noise. Paid in full, gold dust, by the laws of the territory. And, by the laws of the heart, she is mine. We jumped the broom in the high pass. We shared a hearth. She carries my name. He took another step. And she carries my child. The church went deathly silent. Isabella ripped the veil from her head. She didn't care about the scars anymore. She looked at the man she loved, broken, limping out of place, and magnificent. "It is true," she cried out, her voice ringing clear. "I am Isabella Kincaid, and I will not marry this man." Cornelius, seeing his fortune slipping away, lost his mind. He grabbed Isabella's arm. "You ungrateful, wretched creature, I'll ruin you." "Let her go," Silas growled. Hayes raised his gun. "End of the line, mountain man." But Hayes had forgotten one thing. This wasn't the wilderness. This was a room full of witnesses, including a judge and the police chief. And Silas Kincaid wasn't just a brute anymore. He was a sensation. "Put the gun down, Arthur," a voice called from the side. It was a Pinkerton captain hired by Silas 3 days prior with the last of his gold. Police officers swarmed in from the vestry. "Arthur Hayes, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Silas Kincaid and the arson of the Eagle's Nest homestead," the captain shouted. Hayes looked around. He realized the game was rigged. He lowered the gun. Silas didn't wait for the police. He limped past Hayes, past the stunned senator, and walked up the steps of the altar. Cornelius backed away, trembling. "Stay back. She's a monster. Look at her face." Silas stopped in front of Isabella. He dropped his cane. He reached out with his scarred, trembling hands and cupped her face, the burned side and the smooth side. "I'm looking," Silas said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "And I don't see a monster. I see the woman who saved my life. I see the mother of my child. I see the only beautiful thing in this whole damn city." He kissed her. It wasn't a polite society peck. It was a desperate, claiming kiss, full of 6 months of pain and longing. Isabella clung to him, weeping, burying her face in his rough coat. The high ground. They didn't stay in Boston. The lawsuit regarding the Whitney fortune took a year. But with the testimony of the doctor from the mountains and the evidence of Cornelius's fraud, Isabella won. She took the money, millions of dollars, and she liquidated everything. They returned to the Colorado Territory. They didn't rebuild the cabin. Instead, they bought the entire valley. They built a ranch, a sprawling sanctuary of timber and stone called Kincaid's Rest. Silas never regained the full use of his shoulder, and he walked with a limp until the day he died. But he never needed to hunt for survival again. They had 3 children. The eldest, a boy named Elias, grew up to be a ranger. The people of Oakhaven stopped calling her the Gargoyle when Mrs. Kincaid came to town riding in a fine carriage with her giant of a husband. People tipped their hats, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because everyone knew the story. They knew that the poor mountain man hadn't just bought an ugly bride. He had found a queen in the ashes, and together they had conquered the world. And every year, on October 14th, Silas would place a small pouch of gold dust on the mantelpiece, kiss his wife's scarred cheek, and whisper, "Best bargain I ever made." What a journey. From the humiliating auction block of a dusty mining town to the marble altars of Boston high society, the story of Silas and Isabella reminds us that true value is never found on the surface. It is forged in the fires of adversity. Silas didn't need a perfect woman. He needed a partner who understood pain. And Isabella didn't need a knight in shining armor. She needed a beast who would tear the world apart to keep her safe. Their scars didn't define them, they bound them together. If you enjoyed this epic tale of romance, revenge, and redemption, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good Western drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Silas should have spared the uncle? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.